Today we're going to cover evolution. Evolution is the scientific theory that species change over time in response to changes in their environment. And we talk about science, we talk about evolution being a theory, and evolution, if you've not heard, is one of the more controversial or disputed concepts in science, because there are some religious groups that feel like it is in opposition to their um, spiritual beliefs. But as scientists, we say that that evolution is a theory, and one of the things that people who are deniers of evolution would say, one of their arguments is that science is just a theory. And when they're using the word theory, they're using the word theory to mean hypothesis, like we use it in common terms. So we would say, I have a theory that the milk went sour because we left it out. And what I don't mean is that I have a theory. What I really mean is that I have a hypothesis. In science, we use the word theory to mean something that has been tested and tested and tested again through experimentation, through the scientific method. It also can't just be one narrow thing. A theory is something that explains a broad range of scientific phenomenon. So there are people who work with fruit flies, and people who work with bacteria, and people who work with trees, and people who work in labs, and people who work out in nature, and they all will talk about evolution about as frequently and with the same amount of importance, because evolution is important to all of that science. And it is the idea that species are going to change over time. So it's not that part of it, as that we talk about it in science and what's important to people who study science, is not, it usually doesn't sound as revolutionary as you would think. It's pretty streamlined. All right, so let's knock out some of the vocab. One of the things we're going to talk about a great deal is adaptation, and adaptation can be a verb meaning a change in species, like these species are adapted, but that's not what we mean when we're talking about it in evolution. We're talking about it as a noun, meaning like a trait or a behavior that allows an organism to survive and thrive, and essentially survive better than a similar organism that doesn't have that adaptation. So let's say you're a rabbit and you have an adaptation, a genetic mutation perhaps, that allows you to have a thicker coat. Well, that might mean that you live for one extra winter, and that might allow you to have another batch of offspring. And by that sense, by having those offspring, some of them would get your adaptation of a thicker coat. That would be a change that was genetic and passed on to offspring from generation to generation. So some examples, there are a bunch of examples about polar bears and penguins, both of which live in very extreme environments that need to have a lot of adaptations so they can survive in those environments. A good thing to point out is that something that is an adaptations go with environments. So if you took this polar bear out of the Arctic, or more reasonably, if the Arctic changed and is perhaps less cold than it used to be, some of these adaptations will not protect the polar bears, and they might need different adaptations to survive. Or they might more likely go extinct because they do not have the adaptations to live in a changing environment. Penguins, likewise. Penguins are fun. There are lots of them in the Arctic, but there are also some that live in the tropics. And they are adapted to live in the water, as opposed to most other birds. They're adapted to fly. They use their wings like flippers, and they are hydrodynamic, meaning that they move quickly and speedily through water. All right, so let's cover some of the history involved. The person that we talk about most when we talk about evolution is Charles Darwin. He was a young man who was not doing much. He didn't have a lot of prospects, and so his family arranged for him to get on a boat called the HMS Beagle. Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, is what the HMS stands for. And that boat was an exploring boat, so it went around the world and observed sort of what the world was like, because in the early 1800s, Europeans didn't know what the world was like, so they were exploring. And he was there to look at different forms of life. So he was the naturalist, so he was there mostly to catch and kill and preserve by like stuffing and taxidermy organisms that he found, or collect them and bring them home alive. So he essentially was collecting organisms. So one of the places that the Beagle went was the Galapagos Islands. They're off the coast of Ecuador, and he observed the interesting organisms that lived there. And one of the things about the Galapagos that makes it sort of counterintuitive that it would have organisms on it is that it came from volcanoes. So one of the things that was understood was how some islands form from volcanoes, so people knew that at that point in time. And because they were volcanic, it was, if you remember back from talking about succession, it was that primary succession. So you had volcano, and it was just I'm going to say this wrong, magma. No, it was like hard lava. And then soil had to form, and then eventually, over time, you had plants. And it's kind of, you get that seeds blow in on storms and whatever, because it is a pretty far distance off of the coast of Ecuador, about 600 miles. So Darwin wanted to know how the plants and animals got to living there. And and one of the things he saw is, let's go back to the picture. Don't write this down. You just saw this. You just wrote this down. There are all these separate islands, and they're a fair distance away from each other. So they can't really, you can't be like, oh, they just jump. Organisms jump from, animals jump from one island to another. They could conceivably swim or do this thing that we call rafting, where there's like a bunch of sticks and weeds and things that literally form a natural raft, and there are some organisms that are on them, and there's a storm or just from tides and whatever, it blows from one island to another. So what Darwin found is that there are the similar types of organisms, like tortoises, that live on all of the Galapagos Islands, but all of the tortoises are a little bit different from each other. There are birds called finches, which are sort of a little songish bird, that live on all the islands, but they are also different from each other. And then there are unique organisms that live on the Galapagos. There are the only marine iguanas on Earth. And they're marine because they swim in the ocean. They eat seaweed. And so they are capable of lowering their body temperature and not dying, although they spend a lot of time basking on rocks for that reason. All right. So Darwin notices these differences in these organisms. One of the things that makes it easy to study animals on the Galapagos is that for some reason, animals that live on islands become very tame and tend to not have a natural fear of humans, and don't for some reason develop a natural fear of humans. So I know I've been to the Japanese island of Miyajima, where there are deer, and you sometimes find these key deer in Key West that are very, very tame. In Miyajima, the deer come and will they walk in buildings and they walk on the street like pigeons, but they're deer, and they will eat your lunch out of your backpack if your backpack isn't secured. They're very much like giant pigeons. And in the Galapagos, you can walk right up to the animals and they don't run away from you. So they seem tame, but they're just not afraid. One of the things that Darwin studied a great deal were these finches, and they are now called Darwin's finches, or that group, because he studied them. And one of the things he noticed is their beak types, because he did, of course, taxidermy them and look at their beaks. And he was, of course, recording other things that he found in the islands. And he found that the beak size and shape had to do with the organisms that these finches were eating for food. So some of them would eat seeds and have a beak that is well adapted to eating seeds, and some of them would have smaller, more precise beaks for catching insects, and some would eat larger fruit and need sharper beaks to sort of cut up the fruit so they could eat it. So Darwin had hypothesized that the finches came from the mainland, and then in his book, which is called On the Origin of Species Through Natural Selection, he comes up with this idea of natural selection. And it was an idea that had been kind of kicking out there, but he really put it down in words. So natural selection is the idea that the process by which characteristics that increase the survival and reproduction are continued and eventually replace less advantageous characteristics. So here, characteristics are like adaptations. All right, so there are some solid keys to natural selection that you should know about, and we'll talk about how they influence natural selection. All right, so the first one, and it doesn't have to be in this order, but a very important one, is overproduction. So overproduction is the idea that you have more babies than will ever live, and can survive to adulthood. So you have look at insects as a great example of this. An insect has 1 billion little babies, and some of them won't make it out of the larval stage, some of them won't make it past, adulthood, and then some of them will live, and if you replace yourself, then you've been successful as an organism. And you can see this in fish, lots of little fish babies, and some of those fish babies are just food for something else. There are other organisms that have other reproductive strategies that have the idea that you would put a lot of care into your offspring, but even then, you often find that organisms have more offspring than the one that you would need to replace yourself. All right, limited resources. So if you have overproduction, so you have too many individuals, and there's not enough food, territory, mates, shelter, any of those things, then you are setting yourself up for the conditions that will lead to natural selection. So all of those organisms are going to need to compete. So our next idea is competition. So if you don't have enough resources and you have too many organisms, then there's definitely going to be competition. Some competition is just built into the way an organism behaves. These two deer are in rut, and so the females are receptive for mating, and so these two males are competing for mates. And hopefully there's some sort of variation, so one of them will make them better at this head-to-head combat, and that will make them, and it's not about necessarily what deer is the strongest. The strongest is a reflection of their general genetic fitness and health. So that variation, it means a lot to those organisms. So you might say these are all finches, purple finches, but some of them are clearly like redder than others, and it seems that in Bird species, a lot of them, they pick the fanciest plumage because it takes a lot of resources to have nice feathers. A sick bird or genetically inferior bird would not have the nice plumage. All right, so if you have all those things, you will have something like differential survival. Differential survival is just a nice way of saying that there are individuals that do not have the right combination of traits for their or adaptations for their environment, and they will die. And the ones that do have the right traits and adaptations, and a lot of this is luck. Think about if you've ever seen like a nest of sea turtles. I teach ocean science, and during ocean science we watch all these videos where these turtle nests hatch, oceanic turtles, and those marine turtles, baby turtles, make their way to the ocean after they hatch because that's where they belong, and there are bunches and bunches of birds eating them on their way to the ocean. And so, the mother turtle has to lay 150 eggs, and of the 150 eggs, maybe 25 of the baby turtles or 50 of the baby turtles make it to the ocean. So none of that has to do, clearly if they're not fast for some reason, if they're, they're short a flipper, they might not make it. But a lot of them are perfectly great turtles that just had bad luck. All right. And so if it happens over time, an adaptation is something that can change a population. And so we don't talk about an organism undergoing evolution, we talk about populations. So an organism can't evolve in the way we talk about evolution as a science. So you can't say this cat evolved, you would say the species of cats evolve. All right, so there are lots of different evolutionary forces. Evolutionary forces are something in an environment that causes a population to change. It might be something like climate change. It could be a different species coming in for a different kind of competition. But whatever it is that causes that, what we call a selection pressure, is an evolutionary force that causes some change in population because a different trait is a better adaptation. All right, so evolutionary forces. It could be mutation, and you have to have these evolutionary forces. I should have said that earlier. If you don't have any of these evolutionary forces, then you will not have evolution happening. So mutation, a change in DNA that causes something to happen to an organism. So here are some mutations in fruit flies. This is a normal fruit fly. This one mutation causes that fruit fly to have 4 wings. If this fruit fly can fly well with these 4 wings, if they're all functional, this might be a positive adaptation. That might be great for this fruit fly. If it makes them just sort of slow and cumbersome, it probably isn't good. They will probably become somebody's food. And this is an adaptation that leads to no wings, or little tiny stunted wings. You can see them here and here. And that probably is bad for those fruit flies, because fruit flies, I work with fruit flies in my summer job, and they can drown in their food, so not so good. It's important that they be able to fly. All right, other things. Gene flow. Gene flow is the movement of individuals into and out of a population. So you've heard the term perhaps gene pool. Gene pool is all the organisms that could potentially reproduce together. So all of the organisms of the same species in the same location, a population, if you will. And then if a bunch, if you have a herd of bison and then a different herd of bison that's slightly larger meets up with that herd and they form one bigger herd, then that's gene flow. And they've brought their bigger, bison genes with them. And that can cause the population to change. Non-random mating. Non-random mating is when a phenotype is selected for by mates. So it's oftentimes a physical characteristic. Sometimes, in frogs, oftentimes they look for a similar This is a female and this is a male, and they are looking for, I think, sorry, maybe it's the other way around now I'm thinking about it, but the female likes to choose a male with a similar spot pattern to herself for mates. That might be the case, or you could have something like the plumage of a don't write this down. Don't write this down at all. Although sexual selection, if you want to skip to the very end of your worksheet, you can do that. Sexual selection in peacocks, the female chooses the peacock with literally the most eye spots on its plumage. And that is a very non-random mating. That female is choosing the best peacock there is, and that's why peacocks keep getting bigger and bigger tails. It's not actually great for them, but it's a thing. Evolution can happen to an organism because of genetic drift. Genetic drift is the idea that something happens in a population that removes a certain amount of one kind of allele. So in this case, and it's just random bad luck. So in this case, you have the Japanese beetles and you have the potato bugs, as we call them at my house. So like they're the same beetle, but some of them are brown and some of them are sort of iridescent. If this is the ratio of those two different types in the population, and something comes along and just happens to randomly kill 2/3 of the green bugs, now the population has really changed and you're going to have more of the brown bugs in the next generation. And so genetic drift is something that happens particularly in very small populations where this is more likely to happen. All right, so evidence for evolution. One of these is homologous structures. The other class that I teach is anatomy, and I always love to look at skeletons because of that. And if you look at the human arm, which has a humerus, and then a radius and an ulna, and then phalanges, which are your fingers, and then carpals, which are your wrist bones, you can find a similar structure in alligators. So a human uses their arm for manual dexterity, to write, to throw a spear, to, climb a tree. Alligators have the same bones. They have a humerus, they have a radius and ulna, they have carpals, they have phalanges. But they are using their front limb, or their forelimb, as like another foot. And so it's adapted, same bones, but adapted for a very different purpose. And what you would say from that is those homologous structures is that as animals, humans and alligators share a common ancestor, and that we evolved away from them in different directions. Humans and we're talking about like billions of years ago. All right. Penguins. Penguins we talked about penguins earlier, but they have the same types of bones. They have a humerus, a radius, and ulna, and then their phalanges are like sort of, a lot of their carpals and phalanges are fused together in fatter, thicker bones. And theirs are adapted for swimming. And then bats, which are actually of these animals are the ones that are closest in relationship to us, are mammals. They have a radius and an ulna, a humerus, carpals. One of their carpals is like this weird little thumb thing that they use for grasping. And then their phalanges are long and thin and spread out across their webbed wing, and they use their forelimbs for flight. So these, as animals, we all share a common ancestor, but the homologous structures are used differently in different organisms. Sort of the opposite of this is a vestigial structure. So vestigial structure is a structure that an organism has that they don't use anymore. In humans, an example of that is your appendix. Your appendix does not serve a function. You could remove your appendix and you would be fine. But in whales, a whale has a pelvis that it's not using either because it doesn't have any hind legs. We'll look at that in a minute. So it's something that an ancestral organism, like way back your family line, millions and millions and millions of years ago, whales had hind legs. You have an appendix, and an appendix is analogous to a cecum. A cecum is like an appendix, sticks off of the large intestine of birds and rabbits, and it allows them to eat grasses and things that we can all eat grass, but you can't digest grass. If you have a dog, you probably understand this concept, or sometimes a cat. They'll eat it, and then it comes out, and it still is grass. So you do this because your cat also does not have a cecum, and nor does your dog. But a rabbit can eat some grass and digest that grass. And that's because they have a cecum it's larger, and it allows for fermentation of cellulose. Another example here is a snake. On a snake, they have a femur. Femur's a little tiny thing, and an ilium, and they are the vestigial structures of hind limbs that snakes used to have. And you can actually see this on the outside of a snake. Next time you catch a snake, flip it over and look for its vestigial structures of its femurs. Embryology, if you look back, these are all these different organisms: fishes, tortoises, chickens, rabbits, humans, and if you trace their embryos back to the very earliest stages of development, when they start to differentiate and get different parts of the body, you can see that they look very similar between these species. So also hinting towards a common ancestor. All right. One of the great evidences for evolution is fossil evidence. Fossil evidence helps you formulate different ideas for evolution, and then also helps explain and fill in gaps. So time in millions of years is here on this axis, and then it's showing you different relationships, and this is how essentially marine mammals evolved. And so you have modern toothed whales skeletons are here, and so they have a little hind limb. Toothed whales are things like dolphins and orcas, and they do have sort of a predator's face. And then you have 40 million years ago organisms that had some of these. If you could see it better, you could see some of these are bones that have been found as skeletons, as fossils, and some of them are proposed. And then if you go back even further, you can find that these hind limbs have really grown out, and the tail that is very sort of fish-like here is significantly less fish-like for 50 million years ago. And then 60 million years ago, they had proposed that the ancestors of whales were actually four-limbed mammals that had lived on land, but lived in close proximity to the sea, that spent more time in the ocean. And the ones that were best adapted for living in the oceans were the ones that survived and gave rise to these marine mammal species. All right, and then they're just simply examples of evolution that we see every day in the world. One of the best known examples is pepper moths. Pepper moths come in two varieties. You can see one here, but you can also see a second one here. So they have a dark form and a light form. And in England, they live in forests in England. And in England, once upon a time, they came in these two varieties, but the vast majority of them were the light form because they blend in so well with the lichen that is on the trees. Then comes the Industrial Revolution, which you hopefully learned about in the social studies class. There is a bunch of smoke because we don't know anything about pollution. And so there's smoke from factories, and it causes this soot to be all over everything, including the trees. And so before you know it, in the course of 10 years, the pepper moths go from being the light form in the majority to being the dark form in the majority. So this population changed over time. Another great example of natural selection is antibiotic resistance. Microbes, bacteria, can be killed with antibiotics. However, they also reproduce very quickly. So if you have an antibiotic and it kills 90% of the bacteria that you have, well, the 10% that are left are the 10% that are best at living in the presence of that antibiotic. So when that antibiotic is going to repopulate, and that bacteria comes back, then it will be better at living in the presence of that antibiotic, to the point where there are many antibiotics that are now completely useless. Oh, I was supposed to show you this picture. Light form and dark form, and you can see all the soot. All right, other concepts in evolution. One is sexual selection that we sort of covered before when we talked about competition and non-random mating. But sexual selection is something that drives evolution. So the sexual selection of hens, which is what you call a female peacock, for males with elaborate tails has caused the males with elaborate tails to be the predominant peacocks, because the other ones don't get to pass on their genes because they do not have this beautiful tail that is what all the females want to mate with. So the one with the most elaborate tails get to mate with the most and pass on that elaborate tail gene to all of its offspring. Coevolution is something that is really cool. It happens a lot between plants and the organisms that pollinate them. So whether that be insects, bats, birds, and what can happen is that it allows the pollinator evolves a way of getting nectar from its nectar, because that's how the plants lure the pollinators in. And the plant evolves a way of getting its pollen on the pollinator. So the pollinator gets something to eat, and the plant gets someone to transmit their genes, their gametes, farther away from them so they don't have to compete with their offspring. All right, that brings us to the end of our evolution lecture. I hope that it was edifying, and don't forget to hand in your work on Google Classroom.